The quantum sensor alerts woke Keith from a light sleep. But it was the distinctive sound of his old Remington 55 hitting the floor that brought him fully alert. He'd taken to keeping the ancient rifle close ever since the attacks had started. His quantum spear hummed from its charging rack, but there was something reassuring about cold steel and traditional ballistics. Movement in Sector 7, Gustavo reported over the tactical net. Similar pattern to yesterday's horror breach. Keith was already moving, his power armor materializing around him as Fort San Jacinto's systems responded to the alert. Through the armored viewport, he could see the familiar hellscape of their new posting, rivers of lava cutting through obsidian plains, under perpetual ash clouds. "What's the count on non-night personnel still planetside?" he asked, checking both his quantum spear and the Remington. The rifles would stock bore generations of Cole family notches, each marking a successful defense of their ranch. "Last transport leaves in 20 minutes, Rogers replied. Krallian scientific team and 3 Vort maintenance crews. Make sure they're on it." Keith studied the tactical display, watching the supposed horror breach developing in Sector 7. "Because I've got a feeling our visitors aren't actually coming from inside the planet this time." Commander Walsh's voice joined the channel. "You seeing what I'm seeing, son?" "Yes, sir." "That's not cosmic horror movement, that's assault formation. Trying to look random, but there's pattern there." Keith highlighted several points on the display. "See how they're probing our response times? Testing our coverage, just like you said yesterday." Walsh's approval was clear. "Military precision pretending to be chaos." Keith nodded, remembering similar patterns from his night training. But something about the formation seemed familiar in another way. Then it hit him. "Sir, that's Darthan Legion tactics, 7th Claw variant. You sure about that?" "Yes, sir. Studied their combat doctrine at the academy. They're famous for intricate attack patterns, but they always follow certain rules of engagement. What we're seeing, it's textbook Darthan just dressed up to look like cosmic horror activity." The tactical display flashed as another breach began forming. "Right on schedule," Keith noted. Almost like they were operating on a military timetable rather than the unpredictable nature of true cosmic incursions. "All nights, battle stations," Walsh ordered. "And someone get me Captain Venn of the Krallian science team. I want to know why his people keep having equipment malfunctions that delay their evacuation." Keith was already moving toward the armory, where their latest shipment had arrived. The room was filled with both quantum weapons and what many would consider antiques, rows of traditional firearms that had served Texas well for centuries. "Sir," he reported, "I think I know why they're so interested in that Krallian team. The captain's got full access to our containment protocols." "Had access," Walsh corrected. "As of now, this facility is nights only. Gustavo, escort our remaining guests to their transport." Personally, Keith selected a few choice pieces from the armory, his quantum spear, of course, but also the Remington and a sweet old Colt that reminded him of home. As he headed for Sector 7, his tactical display tracked multiple signatures, trying very hard to look like cosmic horrors, but moving with just a bit too much precision. "You know," he commented over the command channel, "my granddad used to say that the thing about predators is they hunt different from soldiers. Predators are efficient, no wasted movement, no repeated patterns, but soldiers, they can't help but fall back on their training. And what are you seeing out there, son? Whole lot of wasted movement, sir. Whole lot of repeated patterns." And he adjusted his sensors, confirming a suspicion, energy signatures that matched known Darthan cloaking technology. Walsh's quiet laugh carried over the channel. "Seems our friends out there didn't do their homework. You'd think they'd have learned by now about Texas nights." "To be fair, sir," Keith replied, checking his weapons one final time, "most folks have trouble believing all the stories about us until it's too late." The final civilian transport lifted off as the horror breach in Sector 7 reached its peak. Keith watched through his tactical display as the Darthan forces, still thinking themselves undetected, moved into what they thought was an optimal attack position. "Sir," he called in, requesting permission to explain to our visitors why pretending to be cosmic horrors in Texas territory is a poor career choice. "Permission granted, Lieutenant Cole." Walsh's voice carried that particular tone that meant someone was about to learn an expensive lesson. "Let's show them the difference between real cosmic horrors and pale imitations." Keith chambered around in the Remington as his quantum spear hummed to life. Around him, 30 Texas Knights moved into position, their black armor absorbing the volcanic light, while their quantum spurs left trails of blue fire across the obsidian plains. The Darthans were about to learn what every other force in the galaxy eventually figured out. There were things far scarier than cosmic horrors. and most of them wore Stetsons. Keith studied the quantum scanner readouts from his position on Fort San Jacinto's eastern wall. The Darthan Legion had gone quiet after yesterday's failed horror breach, but his family hadn't survived generations of ranching on Larch 11 by mistaking silence for safety. Got something, Gustavo called over the tactical net. Deep scan shows energy signatures trying to mask themselves in the lava flows. Now that's interesting, Keith replied, shouldering his Remington while checking the data. Darthan cloaking tech doesn't handle extreme heat well. They're having to modify their approach. Commander Walsh's voice carried that particular tone of someone watching prey walk into a trap. And how many modifications you count so far, son? 7 distinct patterns, sir. They're testing responses, trying to find our blind spots. Keith highlighted several points on the tactical display. But they're thinking like soldiers, not horrors. Real cosmic entities don't probe defenses, they just are. He watched as more signatures appeared, each one carefully choreographed to mimic supernatural chaos. But there was something else there, something that made his tactical training and ranching instincts both scream warnings. Sir, he called up enhanced readings, they're mapping our containment systems. Each attack is focused on different control nodes. They're not just trying to scare us off, they're doing recon. Makes sense, Rogers chimed in. Darthan Legion's famous for their prep work. Never strike until they've got a complete tactical picture. Keith nodded, remembering his academy lectures on alien military doctrine. The Darthans were notorious for their methodical approach to warfare, which meant they're not alone, he realized. Darthan Legion never works without backup. These attacks, they're just the survey team. Walsh was quiet for a moment, processing this. Gustavo, what's your read on those energy signatures? Complex, sir. More than we'd expect from a standard Legion unit. They've got some serious tech out there way beyond their usual gear. Keith moved to a different position, his quantum spear humming as it analyzed the lava flows. The Remington's weight was reassuring against his back as he spotted something that didn't quite fit. There, he marked a point on the tactical net. That's not Darthan tech. That's Shazaf phase-shifting equipment. High-end stuff, military grade. Shazaf? Walsh's voice carried surprised concern. They're supposed to be neutral in this sector. Yes, sir. Unless Keith checked his readings again. Unless someone's offering them something worth breaking neutrality for. The tactical display suddenly lit up with new signatures. The horror breach alerts began blaring, but Keith could see the precise military formations hidden beneath the chaos. They weren't even trying to hide their presence anymore, just their true nature. Multiple contacts, Gustavo reported. They're accessing the containment grid, trying to interface with the control nodes. Keith watched as the enemy forces moved with practiced precision. This wasn't just an attack, it was a coordinated operation to seize control of the planet's systems. The Darthan Legion had been mapping their defenses while the Shazaf teams worked out how to breach the containment protocols. Sir, he called in, they're not here to drive us off. They want the control systems intact. They're trying to. He paused as the pieces fell into place. They're trying to figure out how to weaponize what we're containing. Walsh's response was immediate. All Knights battle stations. Lieutenant Cole, show our friends why some forces aren't meant to be weapons. Keith smiled as he brought both his quantum spear and Remington to bear. Around him, Texas Knights moved into defensive positions, their black armor absorbing the volcanic light, while traditional firearms mixed with quantum weapons in a display that would have made their ancestors proud. You know, he commented over the tactical net. My granddad used to say something about folks who thought they could control forces beyond their understanding. What's that, son? He said they usually make 2 mistakes. First, thinking they're smarter than everyone who came before. Keith watched as the enemy forces began their final approach. Second, thinking Texas Knights won't stop them from making the first mistake worse. The obsidian plains trembled as multiple horror breaches opened simultaneously. But Keith could see the military precision behind each one, the careful coordination that no cosmic horror would ever display. Sir, he reported, got eyes on their command unit. They're setting up containment sampling equipment, trying to analyze what's really down there. Can't have that, Walsh replied. Knights of Texas. Show these folks why some knowledge isn't meant for weapons research. Keith brought his quantum spear up as the first wave of horrors approached. The Remington's familiar weight reminded him of long nights defending the ranch from threats both natural and otherwise. The Darthan Legion and their Shazaf allies were about to learn what every force eventually discovered. Some powers weren't meant to be controlled. And Texas Knights didn't just guard against cosmic horrors. They guarded against anyone foolish enough to try using them. The attack began exactly as Keith had predicted, with absolute precision disguised as chaos. Darthan Legion forces breached from the east while Shazaf phase shifters emerged from the lava flows to the west. Both alien forces still maintained their cosmic horror pretense, but their military training showed in every movement. "Sir," Keith called over the tactical net, "they're matching the containment grid's energy frequencies, trying to slip through our quantum shields by mimicking the native forces we're supposed to be containing." Walsh's laugh carried that particular Texas confidence that had made him famous across 3 sectors. "Shame they don't realize those old rifles we brought in don't care about fancy energy matching." Keith smiled as he shouldered his Remington. The attacking forces had clearly spent months studying quantum defenses and cosmic containment protocols, but they'd made the classic mistake of overlooking the basics. "Gustavo, Rogers, traditional weapons free," he ordered. "Let's remind them why Texas kept these around." The first wave of horrors hit their outer perimeter, their advanced cloaking tech making them appear as writhing cosmic abominations, right until traditional ballistic fire cut through their expensive camouflage. "Pace shift this," Gustavo called out as her grandfather's shotgun reduced a Shazaf infiltrator's stealth field to useless static. The enemy forces hesitated, clearly surprised by the effectiveness of what they'd probably dismissed as primitive weapons. That hesitation cost them as Fort San Jacinto's quantum defenses recalibrated to their true signatures. "Got something," Rogers reported. "Data intercept from their command channel. Sir, you need to see this." Keith accessed the captured transmission, his tactical display filling with information that made his blood run cold. The attack wasn't just about capturing the planet's containment systems, it was a proof of concept for something much worse. "They're collecting horror signatures," he reported, watching as specialist teams among the attackers deployed sampling equipment. "Testing how to, sir, they're trying to figure out how to control what we're containing. Turn it into some kind of weapon." "Bold of them to assume those forces can be controlled," Walsh commented dryly. "Lieutenant Cole, would you kindly explain to our visitors why that's a poor life choice?" Keith brought his quantum spear to bear as another wave of disguised troops approached. "Gustavo, Rogers, converge on these coordinates. Let's show them what happens when you try to weaponize things beyond your understanding." The battle that followed would have made his ancestors proud. Texas Knights moved with practiced precision, their traditional weapons cutting through alien stealth tech while quantum spears left trails of blue fire across the obsidian plains. The enemy forces kept trying to adjust to compensate for this unexpected combination of old and new, but they'd built their entire strategy around countering advanced technology. They hadn't prepared for good old-fashioned Texas ingenuity. "Sir," Gustavo called out suddenly, "they're breaching the inner containment sector. Some kind of Keith, you need to see this." Keith turned to see something that made his tactical system spark in protest. The Darthan Legion's true objective became clear as they deployed what looked like a massive containment vessel, something designed to capture and hold forces that were never meant to be contained. "They're not just studying the horrors," he realized. "They're trying to capture samples. Take them off-world." "Not happening," Walsh's voice carried steel. "All Knights, converge on that containment vessel. Lieutenant Cole, you have tactical command." Keith assessed the situation, generations of military and ranching experience combining as he formulated a plan. "Gustavo, Rogers, firing solution Alpha 7. Just like hunting sandworms back home." His fellow Knights understood immediately. Their positions shifted, creating a carefully orchestrated kill zone that the enemy, focused on their sampling equipment, didn't notice until it was too late. "You know," Keith commented, as he brought both quantum spear and Remington to bear, "my father used to say something about forces of nature." "What's that, son?" Walsh asked, though his tone suggested he already knew where this was going. "Said there's 3 kinds of folks in the universe. Ones who respect natural forces, ones who fear them." Keith lined up his shot as the enemy forces finally realized they were surrounded, "and ones who ain't lived long enough to learn better." The containment vessel exploded in a spectacular display of quantum feedback as precisely placed shots, both traditional and advanced, hit its key systems. The Darthan and Shazaf forces found themselves caught between very angry Texas Knights and the very forces they'd tried to capture. "Sir," Keith reported as the enemy's formation broke, getting some interesting readings from their command unit. "Looks like they're not the only ones interested in weaponizing cosmic horrors." "How many?" Walsh asked. "At least 3 other major powers involved in funding this operation. And sir," Keith highlighted a particular data point, "they've got more teams prepped and waiting." This was just the first attempt. Walsh was quiet for a moment as they watched the remaining enemy forces retreat in disarray. "Well now," he finally said. Sounds like we might need to send a clearer message about Texas hospitality. Keith nodded as he collected more data from the destroyed containment vessel. The enemy hadn't just revealed their hand, they'd shown their whole game plan. Now it was time for the Texas Knights to demonstrate why some forces weren't meant to be weapons, and why trying to steal them from under Texas protection was the last mistake any military would ever make. Keith stood in Fort San Jacinto's command center, studying the data they'd recovered from the enemy's containment vessel. Around him, holographic displays showed troop movements from at least 5 different alien military forces staging in nearby systems. The Darthan Legion and Shazaf phase shifters had just been the advance team. "Think we got their attention," Gustavo commented, her family's antique shotgun propped against a console displaying enemy communications intercepts. "That was the plan," Keith replied, adjusting the quantum scanners to track the approaching forces. Nothing brings roaches out of hiding like thinking their first team found something valuable. Commander Walsh's power armor hummed as he studied the tactical display. "How many we expecting, son?" 3 Darthan battle groups, what looks like half the Shazaf deep strike fleet, and Keith highlighted several energy signatures. Something new. Vern shock troops, maybe. Hard to tell with all the stealth systems they're running. Good. Walsh's satisfaction was clear. "Lieutenant Cole, I believe it's time to show these folks why you don't try to steal from Texas." Keith smiled as he brought up the defensive plans he'd spent the last week preparing. The enemy forces thought they were being clever, coordinating a massive strike to overwhelm the Knights' defenses. They didn't realize they were walking into a trap generations in the making. Gustavo, Rogers, status on the special modifications. "Ready," Gustavo reported. "Old family recipes working just fine with the new quantum systems. Defensive grids retuned exactly like you specified," Rogers added. "Though I still can't believe we're using ranching tricks to catch alien military forces." Keith checked his weapons, both the quantum spear and his trusted Remington. "My grandfather used to say that cattle rustlers and army generals make the same mistake. They overthink things." The tactical display lit up as the first wave of enemy forces began their approach. Their formations were perfect, their stealth systems state-of-the-art. Each group had clearly studied the Knights' previous defenses in detail. "They're moving just like you predicted," Walsh observed, running the same patterns they used last time. "Yes, sir." Military forces love their protocols. Keith watched as the enemy ships moved into exactly the positions he'd anticipated. Even alien ones. The attack began with a massive display of simulated cosmic horror breaches, far more sophisticated than their previous attempts. The enemy had clearly learned from their first failure, creating false signatures that would have fooled most defensive systems. But they hadn't counted on Texas ingenuity. Now Keith ordered as the enemy forces hit their first marker. The obsidian plains came alive as carefully hidden quantum traps activated. Traditional hunting snares enhanced with quantum technology caught phase shifters in mid-teleport. Old-fashioned tank traps modified with quantum fields snagged crystal walkers and shock troops. "Just like rounding up wild hexapedes back home," Keith commented as entire enemy formations found themselves caught in what amounted to the galaxy's biggest cattle pen. "Sir," Gustavo called out, getting some interesting readings from their command ships. They're trying to access the containment grid directly." "Right on schedule," Keith replied. He'd known they wouldn't be able to resist one last grab for the planet's power. "Rogers, if you would." The trap's final phase activated as the enemy commanders attempted to breach the planetary control systems. What they thought were containment protocols were actually modified versions of the quantum fields Keith's family had used for generations to protect their ranch. "You know," he said over an open channel as alien stealth systems failed and quantum drives stalled, "my father always said the thing about trying to steal what isn't yours." The enemy forces found themselves completely immobilized, caught between overlapping fields of traditional and quantum containment systems. Their advanced technology, designed to counter modern military responses, proved useless against techniques pioneered by Texas ranchers and enhanced by Knight technology. "The thing about stealing," Keith continued, "is that sometimes the simple solutions work best." Walsh's laugh carried across the tactical net as they watched the enemy's careful plans fall apart. "Lieutenant Cole, I do believe these folks need a more personal explanation of Texas hospitality." Keith nodded, bringing his quantum spear to full power while checking his Remington one last time. Around him, Texas Knights moved into position, their black armor absorbing the volcanic light, as quantum spurs left trails of blue fire across the obsidian plains. "Gustavo, Rogers, round him up," he ordered, Time to explain to these folks why some powers aren't meant to be weapons. The cleanup operation that followed would be talked about in military academies for generations. The Texas Knights demonstrated exactly why their reputation inspired fear across the galaxy, systematically dismantling some of the most advanced military forces ever assembled. And as Keith personally accepted the surrender of 3 different alien commanders, he couldn't help but think his grandfather would have been proud. After all, whether you were dealing with cattle rustlers or alien armies, the principles remained the same. You just had to be stubborn enough to stick to them. The captured alien commanders sat in Fort San Jacinto interrogation room, their various environmental suits humming as they tried to process their defeat. Keith studied them through the quantum-reinforced viewport, his father's old Remington resting casually across his lap. "Still can't believe it," the Darthan Legion commander muttered through their translator. "Defeated by prehistoric weapons and ranch equipment. That's your first problem right there," Keith replied, checking the rifle's well-worn stock. "You thought technology was all that mattered. Never considered that sometimes the old ways work best." Commander Walsh stood beside him, power armor leaving trails of blue fire from his quantum spurs. "Now then, folks, let's talk about who really sent you here." The tactical display showed the aftermath of their victory, dozens of advanced alien warships caught in what amounted to the galaxy's most sophisticated cattle pen. Traditional hunting techniques combined with quantum technology had rounded up some of the most prestigious military forces in known space. The Carthaxian Dominion, the Shazaf commander finally admitted. They promised us power beyond imagination. Said the forces contained here could reshape the galaxy." Keith nodded. The name confirmed their worst fears. The Carthaginians were infamous for their attempts to weaponize forces beyond their control. "And did they tell you," he asked, "what happened to the last 3 species that tried to harvest cosmic horrors?" The alien commanders shifted uncomfortably. The Vern representative's translator crackled with what might have been fear. "They said it was possible. That with proper containment protocols," son, Walsh interrupted, his voice carrying that special Texas tone that could make admirals nervous. "There's only one proper containment protocol for forces like these. You respect them, you guard them, and you make damn sure nobody tries to use them as weapons." Keith pulled up the data they'd recovered from the enemy systems. The Carthaxians' plan was ambitious. They'd intended to create what amounted to cosmic horror batteries, storing and deploying the contained entities as weapons of mass destruction. "You know what the funny thing is?" Keith mused, running his hand along the Remington's barrel. "All that advanced tech, all those fancy plans, and you never asked yourselves one simple question." "What question?" the Darthan commander asked. "Why Texas Knights were chosen to guard this place." The room went quiet as Keith stood, his power armor humming with barely contained energy. Through the viewport, they could see the planet's lava flows shifting in patterns that defied natural law. "See, we understand something you folks don't," he continued. "Something our ancestors learned the hard way, first on Earth, then on 100 worlds after. There are some forces you don't try to control, some powers you don't try to steal." Walsh nodded. "And some folks you don't try to steal from." The tactical display lit up with new warnings, more ships entering the system, but these weren't hostile. The Texas Knights response fleet had arrived, summoned by their victory signal. "So here's what's going to happen," Keith explained, setting his rifle down carefully. "You're going to tell us everything about the Carthaxians' plans. Every cell, every agent, every operation. And then we're going to explain to them personally why cosmic horrors aren't meant to be weapons." The alien commanders looked at each other, finally understanding the true magnitude of their mistake. They hadn't just failed to capture unimaginable power. They'd given Texas Knights a reason to go hunting. "Lieutenant Cole," Walsh's voice carried both approval and anticipation, "I believe it's time we showed the galaxy why some forces are best left under Texas protection." Keith smiled as he checked his quantum spear's charge. Around them, Fort San Jacinto hummed with power as more Knights arrived, their black armor absorbing the volcanic light, while quantum spurs left trails of blue fire across the obsidian plains. The Carthaxians had made the same mistake so many others had made before them. They'd looked at Texas Knights and seen simple warriors with quaint traditions and outdated weapons. They hadn't understood that those traditions, those seemingly primitive tools, were part of something deeper. Something that understood that the greatest power wasn't in controlling cosmic forces. It was in knowing when to stand guard against those who would try. As Keith prepared to coordinate their response to this greater threat, he couldn't help but smile. His family had been protecting things beyond understanding for generations, first cattle from rustlers, then settlers from raiders, then whole worlds from those who would do them harm. Now they were protecting the galaxy itself from forces that defied comprehension, and doing it the Texas way with quantum spurs, ancient rifles, and an unwavering determination to keep the peace, no matter what horrors, cosmic or otherwise, might try to break it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.